a fucking punk rocker, you fucking half sissy.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are here to talk about Pantera, a band that has arguably done more to change metal than anybody else not named Metallica or Black Sabbath. Pantera hit the mainstream at a time when metal was honestly at kind of a low point, almost single-handedly reviving it and breathing new life into the genre at a time when grunge and alternative had kind of sucked up all the oxygen. And they made absolutely no compromises along the way, with every album getting heavier than the last one, even hitting #1 on Billboard with an album that sounded like this. And in the process, they basically completely rewrote the blueprint for metal, adding groove and a hardcore sensibility that made the genre feel modern again, which set the stage for the next two big movements in metal, which was nu metal and metalcore, and along the way completely redefined the sound of metal production. So how did they do it? And what exactly is Pantera's lasting impact on metal and music in general? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. And also, this video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. It's a free-to-play action RPG with console-quality graphics, and now let's open up some shards and see what champions I get. Executioner, very metal, and Seducer, very goth, and Sylar, what a baddie. Just download Raid Shadow Legends using the links below, copy your in-game player ID, and then venture over to raidyard.playarium.com from October 15th until November 10th. You can win everything from epic and legendary Halloween-themed champions to Amazon gift cards with a total value of $20,000. Click my link in the description or scan the QR code to get these insane bonuses available only through my link. We are talking an epic champion named Knight Errant, and other useful things like an energy refill, skill tome, and XP booster. So don't forget to use my Raid Shadow Legends link in the description or scan my QR code on the screen right now to get insane bonuses for new players with an epic champion. Pantera formed in 1981 in Arlington, Texas. The Abbott brothers, better known as Vinnie Paul and Dimebag Darrell, grew up around music, with their father being a successful country songwriter and producer who also owned a studio called Pantego Studios. And although they broke into the national scene with Cowboys From Hell in 1990, they actually released 4 albums before that, starting with Metal Magic in 1983. Which really looked and sounded more like a turbocharged version of Kiss than what the band would later become. But unlike 99% of bands that get more accessible with every album, Pantera did the opposite. They got heavier. Especially when Phil Anselmo joined for their 4th album, Power Metal, which is really the first time when you can start to hear that trademark Pantera sound. As Vinnie Paul said about their thinking at the time, "These fancy clothes, the spiked up hair, none of this shit is making music, we are. This shit is bullshit, let's get rid of it. Let's just go fucking balls out and see what happens." Which is exactly what they did, and ironically is also what led to their mainstream success. They started to break through with Cowboys From Hell in 1990, which is when Pantera really started to sound like, well, Pantera. You see us coming and you all together. One particularly big moment for them came in 1991 when they played the Monsters of Rock show in Moscow shortly after the fall of the USSR. They opened for Metallica and AC/DC to something like 250,000 people at 10 in the morning and absolutely stole the show despite being jet lagged, as documented in the video for Domination.
A mere 250,000 at 10 in the morning. Whatever the fuck, man, right? A lot of people that are in the morning. Perfect for these guys. Perfect. The way the film came off, the way of Diamond, come on, dude, untouchable.
And all of that set the stage for their true breakthrough with Vulgar Display of Power in 1992, which blew up in large part due to the incredibly popular MTV show Beavis and Butthead.
This guy's dad must have kicked his ass when he was a kid.
Yeah, really. He was like, "Damn it, Pantera, this beer is warm! Get
me another one!
And with that, they quickly became the new face of metal. And so the question that I want to answer is, what is their lasting impact and influence? But really quickly, if you like this video so far, I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button. That way you won't miss any of my videos, and it also really helps the channel. The first part of their legacy, which I think a lot of people maybe still don't understand to this day, is that they played probably a bigger role than any other band in saving metal back in the 90s. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, what do you mean saving metal? 90s metal was amazing. How did it need saving? Well, let me take you back to 1991 or so. Metal was absolutely huge in the 80s with bands like Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses, Poison, and so forth, selling tens of millions of albums and filling stadiums. But by 1992, grunge and alternative had really stolen the spotlight, with bands like Nirvana and R.E.M. at the top of the charts. Then in 1994, Green Day and The Offspring blew up, and punk became kind of the cool new thing, and metal wasn't really doing so great. Metallica was still around, but they had changed their look and sound. Guns N' Roses had kind of fallen apart. Metal wasn't dead, but it was on life support. It really just kind of felt like it was still stuck in the 80s. Guys in tight pants who acted like rock stars really just wasn't the vibe anymore. But when Pantera came along and hit the mainstream thanks to MTV, it almost instantly felt like metal was fresh and new again. And there were a few reasons for that. The first was the sense of groove that they brought to the genre. Thrash metal was kind of the last big thing in metal, and as much as I loved thrash metal back in the day, and I still do, it was kind of stiff and robotic, especially towards the end of thrash's run when a lot of bands were kind of focusing more on being technical than anything else. But Pantera was all about groove.
An extreme, a hard-hitting thing, that grooves that people can move to nonetheless.
And I wasn't the only one who noticed that. No less than Jonathan Davis of Korn said, "The first metal band I ever listened to was Pantera because those grooves were so undeniable." And I think that sense of groove came from a few places, and it's kind of interesting to see how they all work together. First of all was the simple fact that Vinny and Dime were actual brothers who had spent thousands and thousands of hours playing together since they were little kids. And so because of that, they could really lock in with each other in a way that very few other people could. Also, being from Texas rather than California or New York like most of the other thrash bands, they had this kind of subtle undercurrent of bluesy rock and roll that really set them apart. In particular, I always heard a lot of ZZ Top in Vinnie Paul's playing, and apparently I wasn't imagining things.
If you take a look at this band and you take just two bands you had to pick out of there, it would be Van Halen and ZZ Top sped up in that 6/8.
Right.
That's what that Texas stomp boogie, as we used to call it, was all about.
And if you listen to a ZZ Top song like Sharp Dressed Man, you can hear it. Pantera is really almost like a supercharged version of this with maybe some Slayer thrown in the mix. And the second place where they got that sense of groove was their hardcore influences, most of which came from Phil Anselmo. As he put it, "Punk rock was never really my forte, but when hardcore came in, that's where it caught my ear. My influences as a singer ranged from Roger Miret of Agnostic Front to Henry Rollins, of course, and Rob Halford of Judas Priest." And you can really hear how those hardcore influences that Phil brought in transformed the band. For example, listen to The Eliminator by Agnostic Front. Pantera's Fucking Hostile is really just an updated, much tighter version of that same song, right?
1, 2, 3, 4. Almost every day, I see the same face. A broken picture too. It's busy out of town.
And now that's come full circle with Pantera being one of the biggest influences on modern hardcore. For example, there's even a hardcore band called Vulgar Display. And speaking of the vocals, Phil's style in particular was an absolutely huge part of what made Pantera feel fresh and modern to me. Like I said, I love thrash metal, but even as a kid, I always thought the vocals were kind of the weak spot of the genre compared to hardcore. There were so many bands like Exodus or Testament that I really tried to like, I wanted to like, but the vocals were just too corny for me to get past. And also, just to be honest, by the early 90s, that whole look of like the denim vests and leather pants and all that stuff was really just kind of dated. It felt like all those bands were still part of another decade. So when I saw Pantera come along with Phil having a shaved head and the tattoos and cargo shorts, looking and sounding like a more metal version of Henry Rollins, I was like, oh, fuck yes, this is what I've been waiting for. And those hardcore influences especially made the band feel relevant in the context of the early 90s. What I mean is that grunge bands like Soundgarden, Nirvana, and Pearl Jam were always talking about their punk influences. For example, example, Kurt Cobain had Bad Brains, Millions of Dead Cops, and Black Flag on his top 50 albums list. And then, of course, later on with Green Day and The Offspring blowing up, punk was just a huge part of the cultural discourse at the time. And so with those influences, Pantera just sort of fit into the zeitgeist of the 90s in a way that earlier bands like, say, Exodus or Testament just didn't. In fact, if anything, I feel like Pantera almost single-handedly killed thrash by making it sound so dated by comparison. I mean, how could you really go back to listening to, say, Forbidden after you've heard this? And speaking of which, one question that always comes up when we talk about how Pantera changed their sound is, well, didn't they just copy that from that band Ex-Hoarder? Which honestly I think is a fair question to ask, because if you've never heard Ex-Hoarder, they were a fairly obscure thrash band from New Orleans that was doing this sound as early as 1986. And well, it definitely does sound a lot like Phil era Pantera. Phil was also a big fan of the band and had been friends with them for years, so I think it's reasonable to ask that question, but I tend to agree with what Ex-Hoarder vocalist Kyle Thomas said about it.
In a way, there was things that we were doing that they eventually did, and we were doing them first, but that doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that there was anything, any kind of blatant ripoff or anything.
I think there's definitely some influence there. I mean, you can just hear that. But in my opinion, Pantera added a lot of other unique things to the mix, and frankly, just did it better than Ex-Hoarder ever did. With all of that said, when it came time to follow up Vulgar Display of Power, and they were trying to decide what direction to take, bassist Rex Brown said, the record company was pushing for something like Metallica's Black Album. We were like, no, that's not going to happen. And to prove that they had no intentions of selling out or going soft, with their next album, Far Beyond Driven, in 1994, they did the seemingly impossible. They debuted at #1 on Billboard, while somehow getting even heavier than Vulgar Display of Power. For example, opening with the song Strength Beyond Strength, which I would say is the heaviest song they had done to date. Or Slaughtered, which, if you ask me, is still pretty damn heavy even by modern standards. And as far as I'm aware, Far Beyond Driven is still the heaviest album ever to hit #1 on Billboard. On this album, Dimebag also started to use the Digitech whammy pedal, especially on the song Becoming, which was based on a kick drum pattern that Vinny was playing around with and eventually turned into an entire song. And again, I think this song sounds shockingly modern even by today's standards. And in 1994, it sounded like something from another dimension. Back then, nobody other than maybe Fear Factory was doing that kind of thing with those really complex kick drum patterns that doubled the guitars, especially not mixed with that skronky, squealy whammy pedal sound. And if you fast forward almost 30 years, that song is essentially the template for what bands like Amir and Darko US are doing now. That is how ahead of the curve this album was. And so you put all of that together and you can see how with that 3-album run, Pantera really laid the foundation for the next 20 years of metal. They inspired Korn, who in turn created the entire genre of nu metal, and even more directly, they inspired the so-called new wave of American heavy metal in the 2000s with early metalcore bands like Killswitch Engage, Lamb of God, and Chimera, who in many ways picked up where Pantera left off. The biggest thing in early metalcore was an emphasis on breakdowns, which I definitely don't think Pantera single-handedly created, but they definitely did have a big role in popularizing breakdowns with the ending part of Domination. And so if you listen to those metalcore bands, something like this to me sounds very much like an updated version of a song that could have been on Far Beyond Driven. And to be clear, I'm not taking anything away from those bands because I think they're all incredible and they definitely brought a lot of new things to the table. In particular, the addition of the melodic death metal riffs inspired by At the Gates and In Flames. My point is just that they were building on the foundation that Pantera laid down, which I'm sure they would agree with. Another part of their influence that I think doesn't get discussed enough is how much they really redefined metal production. As no less than the legendary Zakk Wylde said, they changed the way that records sound. Production-wise, you can use those Pantera records as a Model T Ford for extreme metal. It's like, this is how these records and this style of music have to be made. And I think he is 100% right about that. Pantera's sound they created with their producer Terry Date, starting with Cowboys From Hell, was absolutely the template for modern metal to this day. The 80s bands like Metallica and Megadeth kind of started to get there. For example, the double bass part in One.
Darkness imprisoning me. All that I see, absolute horror. I cannot live, I cannot die.
But with all due respect to them, what Pantera did just a few years later, with parts like the breakdown in Domination, and especially Vulgar Display of Power, just completely blew that stuff out of the water. In particular, those incredibly punchy drums with tons of attack that perfectly complemented those super tight palm-muted guitar parts and just made metal sound heavier and more aggressive than it ever had before. To me, this is the dawn of the modern metal sound. Metal drums in particular just never sounded the same after Pantera, although these days a lot of drummers have to use samples to do what Pantera did naturally. As producer Terry Date later said, "We used to get accused all the time of sampling the drums, and we never did. Those were all just meticulously chosen sounds that we all worked really hard to get. And then, of course, the performances were played until they were right." Honestly, that's what most bands now just don't want to do. Putting in those thousands and thousands of hours to be that tight. In particular, I think Pantera, or maybe more accurately Phil Anselmo, also did more to popularize stoner and sludge metal than anybody else on the planet, with his side project Down that started in 1995 with members of Corrosion of Conformity, Crowbar, and I Hate God.
I should have stolen the crown.
As he said, "I was getting into slower bands and revisiting a lot of the bands I had grown up with, like Witchfinder General. The faster music for me, thrash music, and early shades of death metal was getting a little bit boring because it was getting redundant. And up until that point, sludge metal was really kind of a niche within a niche. Like, even metal fans didn't really listen to or know about this stuff. But thanks to Down getting on MTV and the radio and playing to thousands of people every time they did a show, now millions of people in the mainstream metal audience were exposed to the genre, and then probably looked up the members' other bands and their influences, and then they discovered bands like I Hate God, Acid Bath, and Soylent Green. And it's still a pretty small genre, but I'm pretty sure that it wouldn't be anything like what it is now with this just insanely dedicated fan base all over the world, without Phil putting it on the map the way that he did. And of course, last but most definitely not least, we have to talk about Dimebag Darrell, who is my personal favorite guitarist of all time. If you ever heard me play guitar for literally 1 second, it would be instantly obvious how much I have borrowed from him. And I could easily make an entire video just about him, but what it comes down to is this. He is a legend. He is right up there with the absolute best of the best of the best, like Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads, who, to put it simply, just completely transformed metal guitar forever. To me, what's really special about Dimebag is that he is one of those very rare guitarists where literally nobody else on the planet can sound like him. You can play the same song note for note with the exact same gear, but it still just won't sound like him. There's just something unique in his hands that nobody else will ever have. The fact of the matter is that there only ever was and ever will be one Dimebag Darrell. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Also, I would like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my podcasts and videos early. There are members-only channels in my Discord that I'm super active in. I do giveaways sometimes, and there's a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.